Lost Blood, the Cherokee DNA Mystery. Geneticists found, when they mapped the DNA of Cherokee tribal members in the early 21st century, a set of genetic markers that did not fit the standard model of how and when the Americas were populated. And that finding reopened questions about Cherokee origins that have been debated since the first European explorers entered the southern Appalachian Mountains. But to understand what that science revealed, you have to understand who the Cherokee were before the world changed around them. The Cherokee called themselves Tsalagi, the principal people. They were the dominant nation of the southern Appalachian highlands, occupying a territory that covered parts of what are now Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Alabama. At the height of their power in the 18th century, their population was estimated at between 16 and 22,000 people, organized into dozens of towns connected by trade routes, diplomatic networks, and a shared legal and cultural framework that European observers found difficult to dismiss. What made the Cherokee remarkable was not any lack of civilization before European contact. It was the speed and deliberateness with which they engaged with the new world being imposed upon them. In the 1820s, a Cherokee man named Sequoyah completed a syllabary, a writing system, for the Cherokee language. Within a few years, the majority of Cherokee adults were literate in their own language. A Cherokee language newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, began publishing in 1828. The Cherokee Nation adopted a written constitution modeled partly on that of the United States, with an elected principal chief, a bicameral legislature, and a Supreme Court. They built farms, schools, and legal institutions. They sued in the United States Supreme Court and won. And still, in 1838, the United States government forced them out of their homeland at gunpoint. The DNA mystery scientists uncovered 2 centuries later begins long before that expulsion, and its resolution may change how we understand not just the Cherokee, but the entire prehistory of the Americas. Historical records found in the archives of the United States War Department document the removal of the Cherokee Nation from their ancestral homeland in 1838 and 1839, with a bureaucratic precision that makes the scale of the catastrophe entirely measurable and entirely undeniable. The legal foundation was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. The act authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties with southeastern tribes, exchanging their eastern lands for territory west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee Nation challenged the law in the United States Supreme Court. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831 and Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in ways that acknowledged Cherokee sovereignty and limited Georgia's authority over their territory. President Jackson refused to enforce the rulings. The phrase attributed to him, that Chief Justice Marshall had made his decision and could now enforce it himself, captures the political reality precisely. Federal military power was on the side of removal, and legal victories meant nothing without the force to implement them. John Ross, the elected principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, fought the removal through every legal and political channel available. He was still fighting when federal troops began rounding up Cherokee families in the spring and summer of 1838, moving them into stockades before the overland march to what is now Oklahoma. The march took place largely in the winter of 1838 to 1839. Estimates of the deaths vary, but the scholarly consensus places the number between 4,000 and 8,000 people, dead of cold, disease, exhaustion, and starvation, along a route that the Cherokee called Nunadaltsuni, the trail where they cried. Among the documented consequences of the removal was the destruction of family records, genealogical knowledge, and community archives. What DNA science later found in the Cherokee genome is entangled inseparably with this history. Genetic researchers found, when they analyzed DNA samples from members of the Cherokee Nation in population studies conducted in the early 2000s, the presence of mitochondrial haplogroup X, a genetic lineage whose distribution pattern raised questions that standard models of American prehistory did not fully answer. Haplogroup X is one of the 5 major mitochondrial lineages found in Native American populations. The other 4, A, B, C, and D, are present across indigenous populations throughout North and South America and are clearly linked, through ancient DNA analysis, to ancestral populations in northeastern Asia. Haplogroup X is different. It is found at low frequencies in Native American populations, but it is also found in populations in the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of Europe, particularly in the Druze of Lebanon and Syria, in certain populations of the Caucasus, and in some Siberian groups. The distribution of Haplogroup X in the Americas is unusual. It appears at higher frequencies in some Great Lakes area populations and in certain southeastern groups, including the Cherokee. It is largely absent from populations in Siberia and northeastern Asia, which are otherwise the closest genetic relatives of Native Americans. This geographic gap is the core of the scientific puzzle. If Haplogroup X entered the Americas with the initial migrations across the Bering Land Bridge, it should appear in northeastern Asian populations, and it largely does not. Some researchers proposed that it entered the Americas through a separate and distinct migration, perhaps following a different route or arriving at a different time. Others argued that Siberian populations carrying Haplogroup X simply went extinct on the Asian side, erasing the connecting link that would otherwise make the pattern easy to explain. The ancient DNA record from Siberian and Central Asian sites has partially, but not completely, resolved the question. Haplogroup X has been found in ancient samples from the Altai region, suggesting a possible Asian source population. But the distribution remains uneven, and the pathway into the Americas is still contested among specialists. What is not disputed is that the haplogroup is real, measurable, and present in the Cherokee. The science confirmed that. What it means is still being worked out. Historical documents found in 18th century colonial archives record one of the oldest and most persistent theories about Cherokee origins, a theory proposed by traders, missionaries, and colonial observers who believed they recognized in Cherokee customs and language the traces of a completely different ancient world. James Adair was a British trader who spent roughly 40 years living among the southeastern tribes, including the Cherokee, beginning in the 1730s. In 1775, he published a book, The History of the American Indians, in which he argued at length that the Cherokee and several other southeastern tribes were descended from the ancient Israelites, specifically from the 10 lost tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel, whose fate after the Assyrian conquest in the 8th century BCE has never been established with certainty. Adair's argument was built on a catalogue of observed similarities. He noted that Cherokee religious practice was monotheistic in a way that resembled the theology of ancient Israel, centered on a single supreme deity, with ritual practices that he compared to Jewish festivals and purification ceremonies. He identified linguistic parallels between Cherokee words and Hebrew roots. He noted similarities in ceremonial calendar structures. The most striking physical piece of evidence associated with this theory is the Bat Creek Stone, an inscribed tablet found in 1889 in a burial mound in Tennessee, excavated by the Smithsonian Institution. A majority of mainstream archaeologists consider the inscription to be either 19th century Cherokee script or a forgery introduced after the excavation. A minority of researchers have argued the inscription contains ancient Hebrew letters. The theory has never been accepted by mainstream scholarship, but it has never entirely disappeared either, and the distribution of Haplogroup X in Cherokee DNA has given it a new, if contested, scientific dimension. Archaeological records found at copper mining sites across the Great Lakes region document one of the largest and most sustained prehistoric mining operations in the world, an operation that extracted an estimated 500,000 tons of copper over several thousand years, beginning around 3000 BCE and whose end product has never been fully accounted for within North American archaeological contexts alone. This is the factual foundation on which a broader theory has been constructed. The theory that ancient maritime traders, possibly including Phoenician navigators from the eastern Mediterranean, made contact with the North American continent long before Columbus, and that traces of those contacts survive in the genetics of populations like the Cherokee. The Phoenicians were the dominant maritime traders of the ancient Mediterranean world from roughly 1100 BCE to 300 BCE. Their ships reached Britain, where they traded for tin, and they established colonies including Carthage in North Africa. Ancient sources describe Phoenician knowledge of territories beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, and the full extent of their voyaging remains historically debated. The copper mining of the Great Lakes region is archaeologically real, and its scale is extraordinary. Where much of that copper went remains an open question. No confirmed Phoenician site has been found in North America, and the link between Mediterranean traders and Great Lakes copper is a theory, not an established finding. The connection between Cherokee Haplogroup X and Phoenician or Mediterranean genetics appears in popular books and documentaries, but is not supported by peer-reviewed ancient DNA research. What the science does confirm is that Haplogroup X has deep roots in the Middle East and Central Asia, and its presence in the Cherokee is real and requires explanation. Whether that explanation involves transoceanic contact, a separate Beringian migration, or the extinction of connecting populations in Asia, is the question the field is still working to answer. Oral historical accounts preserved in Cherokee tradition and recorded by ethnographers in the 19th and early 20th centuries describe a priestly caste known as the Ani-Kutani, a hereditary group of religious specialists who held significant power within Cherokee society until, according to tradition, they were overthrown and eliminated by the broader population in a revolt that took place in the deep past. The Ani-Kutani accounts are documented primarily through the work of ethnographer James Mooney, whose late 19th century fieldwork with Cherokee communities produced one of the most comprehensive records of Cherokee oral tradition in existence. The accounts describe the Ani-Kutani as possessing specialized knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and ceremonial practice that was not shared with the general population, and as having used that knowledge to accumulate wealth and authority that eventually became oppressive. The revolt that ended the Ani-Kutani is described in the tradition as thorough. The caste was eliminated, its specialized knowledge partly lost, and its hereditary line broken. The accounts say that after the revolt, Cherokee religious practice became more democratized, less centered on a specialized hereditary priesthood, and more accessible to the community as a whole. What makes the Ani-Kutani relevant to the DNA question is this. If a distinct group with different origins had been absorbed into the Cherokee population at some point in the deep past, carrying genetic markers like Haplogroup X, their descendants would be distributed through the modern Cherokee population as exactly the kind of low-frequency anomalous signal that researchers have observed. No genetic study has specifically identified an Ani-Kutani lineage, but the oral tradition's description of a group perceived as different, possessing unusual knowledge, and eventually absorbed into the larger community is a pattern that appears in other populations whose genetic histories have later revealed unexpected complexity. Legal records found in the files of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma document one of the most politically and legally contentious questions in contemporary American indigenous affairs: the question of what Cherokee identity actually means, who gets to define it, and what role, if any, DNA testing plays in that definition. The Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, the largest federally recognized Cherokee tribe, bases tribal citizenship on documented descent from individuals listed on the Dawes Rolls, a federal census of Cherokee citizens conducted between 1898 and 1914. A person can be enrolled as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation regardless of what percentage of their ancestry is Cherokee. What matters is the documentary record, not the biology. This creates an immediate and fundamental conflict with commercial DNA testing. When someone takes a 23andMe or Ancestry DNA test and receives a result showing a small percentage of Native American genetic ancestry, that result does not entitle them to tribal citizenship, does not establish cultural affiliation, and is not recognized by any federally recognized tribe as evidence of membership. The Cherokee princess phenomenon, the widespread American family legend of having a Cherokee great-great-grandmother, has been documented extensively by genealogists and sociologists. Studies suggest that the actual percentage of Americans with documented Cherokee ancestry is far smaller than the percentage who claim it in family tradition. The legend reflects a romanticized relationship with indigeneity that the tribes themselves consistently reject. The case of Senator Elizabeth Warren made this tension nationally visible. Warren had claimed Cherokee and Delaware ancestry based on family tradition. A DNA test in 2018 showed some Native American ancestry, estimated at between 1/64th and 1/1024th. The Cherokee Nation issued a formal statement clarifying that DNA results are not the same as tribal citizenship, and that Warren was not a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. Court documents found in the Federal District Court archives of multiple states record a pattern of legal disputes that extended across decades following the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, a law that required federally funded institutions to inventory their holdings of Native American human remains and sacred objects, and to repatriate them to affiliated tribes upon request. The Cherokee Nation and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians have both been active participants in NAGPRA repatriation processes. The law created a formal mechanism for something Cherokee tradition had always held: that the dead are not objects of study, that ancestral remains belong to the community from which they came, and that the obligations of the living to the dead do not expire with time. DNA analysis has become a tool in the repatriation process in ways that cut in multiple directions. For some cases, ancient DNA from skeletal remains can establish genetic affiliation with modern tribal populations, supporting repatriation claims. For other cases, DNA results have complicated affiliation determinations, particularly for very ancient remains, as the Kennewick Man case demonstrated, where the skeletal morphology and the genetic profile point in different directions from what existing tribal claims assumed. Cherokee medicine practitioners, traditionally called Didanawiski, sometimes translated as those who heal, occupy a specific role in this framework. Their knowledge of plant-based medicine, ceremonial practice, and community healing is not simply historical, it is active. Cherokee ethnobotanical knowledge, documented by researchers working with community permission, has identified plant compounds that pharmacological research has subsequently confirmed as medicinally effective. The relationship between that living, traditional knowledge and the genetic heritage being mapped by modern science is one that Cherokee tribal leadership has engaged with carefully and on their own terms. Archival records found in the Georgia State Legislature and the United States Congress from the period 1828 to 1838 document, with unusual transparency, the actual mechanism by which the Cherokee were removed from their homeland, a mechanism driven not by policy principle, but by the discovery of gold. In the summer of 1829, gold was found in the mountains of northern Georgia, in the heart of Cherokee territory. It was the first significant gold discovery in American history, preceding the California gold rush by nearly 20 years. Within months, thousands of prospectors had illegally entered Cherokee land. The Georgia State Legislature passed laws extending state jurisdiction over Cherokee territory, nullifying Cherokee laws and prohibiting Cherokee people from testifying in state courts against white citizens. The federal government's response was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The proximity in timing between the Georgia gold discovery and the passage of removal legislation is not coincidental. Congressional records from the period show Georgia representatives arguing explicitly for removal on the basis of the territory's mineral wealth. The Cherokee Nation's attempts to use the federal court system to protect their territory produced the landmark Supreme Court cases that acknowledged their sovereignty, and were then ignored by the executive branch. The legal record of this period is one of the clearest documented cases in American history of a government violating its own legal structures to acquire indigenous land and resources. Cherokee oral tradition maintains accounts of mineral wealth hidden from American authorities during and after the removal. Researchers have noted that the geographic distribution of certain Cherokee ceremonial sites correlates with areas of known mineral deposits, though the interpretation of this correlation remains contested. What is not contested is that the gold discovery in Georgia was the proximate cause of one of the largest forced migrations in American history. Scientific publications in Nature Genetics, the American Journal of Human Genetics, and Molecular Biology and Evolution from the first 2 decades of the 21st century collectively represent a revolution in what it is possible to know about the deep human past. And the Cherokee story sits at the intersection of that revolution and a very old argument about who the first Americans were. The Bering Strait model, the theory that the Americas were populated through migrations across a land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska, remains the dominant scientific framework. Ancient DNA evidence has confirmed and refined it extensively. But the model has also been complicated. Ancient DNA from South American skeletons, 9,000 years old, has shown genetic signals related to Pacific populations. The distribution of Haplogroup X in Native American populations, including the Cherokee, remains incompletely explained. The scientific consensus is not that these anomalies disprove the model, they do not, but that the initial peopling of the Americas involved multiple migration events and possibly multiple source populations. For the Cherokee Nation, these scientific questions intersect with a political and legal reality that does not wait for academic consensus. The tribe's sovereignty, land rights, and federal recognition rest on their status as indigenous people with continuous documented presence in their ancestral territory. That status is grounded in treaty law, federal statute, and the political decisions of 3 centuries, not in the outcome of any population genetics study. What the DNA can offer is something different from legal validation. It is a deeper record, evidence of who was here, how long they had been here, and how much more complex the human past is than the textbooks have generally acknowledged. The Cherokee story did not begin with European contact. It did not begin with the Bering Land Bridge. It began in a deep past that modern science is only beginning to read with any precision. And what that science is finding, consistently, is that the simple stories were always the wrong ones.